Before I jump into prayer, I guess I feel like a little way of introduction is, or just a thought I had, is that I think in the past month since we met last, some Baptists have said some very awful things about our Vice President Kamala Harris, and so if ever there's the question, I mean, it seems like the Baptists are always coming out in a bad way on the news, and so it's a relevant question: why are we Baptists, and what does it mean? So I think this conversation is good and relevant, and I'm excited to hear from Slayden, hear more from Slayden. So let me begin us in a word of prayer, and then I'll hand it off to you, Professor. So please pray with me. God, thank you again for just an opportunity to come together and learn and kind of explore what is our identity as Baptists. What does that mean for some of us? We've been Baptists a long time and we never really thought about it. Others have been Baptists and have studied it, and others are just found themselves at a church that happens to be Baptist and are wondering what it's all about. But I have no doubt that we're all going to learn new things from Slayden tonight. So I pray that you'd bless him and speak through him. And I'm sure we'll also learn and grow through each other's questions and the discussion afterwards. So just be with us all as we continue to learn and get to know one another better. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
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 Okay. Most of you, but not all of you, were with us last time, but just a real quick overview. We looked at the beginning of Baptists in Great Britain, or among the British, and they actually began in the Netherlands. But a couple aspects that carry over into the American colonies in the United States that I think are deeply rooted in the Baptists in Britain. One, congregational church government, but associational cooperation. That's a pattern we will see and talk about some tonight. They also, some came in an Arminian theological perspective, and in that it was, they held to an Arminian view of the atonement, that Christ died for everyone, the general Baptist, a general atonement. The particular Baptists came along a couple decades later, and they held to a particular atonement. Christ died only for the elect, for a particular group of people. And we will see that division that is also present in the United States. Baptism for believers, and it eventually worked its way into immersion for baptism for believers as a symbol, not a sacrament. Also, the modern mission movement began in 1792 with the Baptists in Great Britain, the British Baptists at that time, the Baptist Union. And we were the very first denomination to have a society or an organization for international missions. And that carries over. In fact, it helps us to get organized here in the United States. So that's a little bit of the background. I don't know if any of you thought of any questions. It's been a month. If you did, you may have forgotten them if you're like me. But any questions about the British Baptists before we jump into the Baptists in the American colonies? Okay. Baptists in the American colonies began in 1639. Roger Williams is a name that should be familiar to every one of us. He was an English separatist, came over to the colonies in 1631 and became the pastor of the Congregational Church in Salem. New England, and especially Massachusetts Bay, was predominantly, in fact, they had an established church, and that was the Congregational Church. He got into trouble with the authorities. They were very intolerant. He did not like that at all. He questioned whether civil authorities could punish any believer because of their religious beliefs or practices, and that got him into trouble. He eventually got into so much trouble, they dragged him before the courts, and he was found guilty of several different charges, things like, he wanted to, I think, pay the Indians for the land that we took from them, and as well as questions about the church and church matters and toleration. So anyway, he was found guilty. He was going to be sentenced. In fact, he was sentenced to be banished from the colonies. He probably would have been sent to a place like Jamaica, and then from there presumably back to England. And if you were banished and you came back, you could be put to death. In fact, that happened to 4 Quakers in Massachusetts Bay, including one woman, Mary Fisher, as well as 3 other Quakers. They were sent, they were banished to Jamaica, they returned, they were arrested, and they were executed. So religious liberty for all in New England is not exactly the right view when we interpret this. Fake news, I guess we would call it in our day and time. Anyway, Williams was actually warned by John Winthrop that he was going to be banished. And so he fled into an area near Narragansett Bay, and that is a part of what is now Rhode Island. He was very sick. He had to flee in the dead of winter. The Indians took care of him. They nurtured him. He became good friends with them. He put their language into a vocabulary, a written form, and he bought land from them and would establish the First Baptist Church in a place we now call Providence, Rhode Island. Actually, there were some Baptists that came into the area who had been persecuted in Massachusetts Bay, and he talked with them. They influenced him, and he was baptized and formed the First Baptist Church in the American colonies. It's known as First Baptist Church of Providence, Rhode Island today. Beautiful place if you've ever been there. It's a wonderful, you just feel real religious just by walking in. It's a very,
Wow.
very nice place. And I think the pastor at McMinnville, one pastor prior to Erica, I think he left there and went to First Baptist Providence as pastor. Anyway, he formed this colony. He worked at it. It took a number of years, but he wound up going to England and finally in 1663 obtained a charter for Rhode Island colony. And according to Henry C. Better, a Baptist, a historian of Baptists in America, that Rhode Island was the first state, in a general sense of a state, established based upon the principle of religious liberty. Its charter guaranteed religious liberty for all. And one of the things that I really like about Williams is that he insisted upon religious liberty for everyone, including those with whom he vehemently disagreed, and that was the Quakers. He thought that they were too emotional, too active, too obnoxious, but he guaranteed for them religious freedom. And if you guarantee freedom for someone else, then you can protect your own freedoms. And that's one of the things I've told my students through the years. Well, Williams didn't remain a Baptist for very long, 3 to 6 months, somewhere in there. And he began to question his own baptism. I think he believed in some type of apostolic succession, which he couldn't pick up anywhere. So he wound up becoming a seeker for the rest of his life. But because of his views on religious liberty, we have hung on to him as tightly as we can through the years, and he's a hero of Baptists, even though he was one of us only for a short period of time. There was another church, Newport, which also is the second Baptist church in America. It actually claims to be the church. It was founded I think in 1638, that would have been a year before Providence, the First Baptist Providence, but there's no evidence that it became a Baptist church until 1648. So Providence, at least in the minds of most Baptist historians, is the First Baptist church in the American colonies. Other churches arose, other figures arose, and some of the names, Henry Dunster, the president of Harvard University, became a Baptist. And because of that, he was fired. And he was forced to also leave his home in winter, a home that he had built with his own hands for the president's home, but they threw him out anyway. One of the members at the Newport Church wrote a book. I think it was John Clark. I would have to do a little checking on that. Ezekiel Holloman, and he was in England, I think it was, and he wrote a book entitled "Ill News from New England." And it was based on persecution. And one of the stories he told was that of Obadiah Holmes, a member of his church. Holmes and 2 other members went to visit a member of the Newport Church, but he lived in Lynn, Massachusetts, and he was blind, and they went there to take communion to him, and they were arrested. And friends paid the fines for two of the guys, but Holmes would not let his be paid, and he was lashed with 30 lashes. And the wounds were so bad that he wound up having to lie on his stomach at night. It was so painful on them. But when the guy doing the lashing finished, he says, "You have struck me as with roses," kind of in a sense that even in this persecution, there is beauty in it because of his faithfulness to Christ. So there was a lot of persecution going on. Another fella in Kittery, Maine, William Screven, he was in the shipbuilding business. He was arrested all the time. They tried to make him pay fines, and they finally forced him out, and he went with 10 of his members to Charleston, South Carolina, and there in Charleston, South Carolina, established the First Baptist Church of Charleston. So he had an active role not only in New England, but in Charleston. So these were some of the early developments in the New England area. And like I said, there was a lot of persecution there, and Baptists paid a heavy price to be Baptists in that time, but they were a good model for all of us. In the middle colonies, one of the most important developments took place around Philadelphia. And in 1688, a church called the Pennapeck Church, not far from Philadelphia, maybe Greater Philadelphia probably, was organized with 12 members. And the pastor was a young man named Elias Keach. His father was a very well-known British Baptist, Benjamin Keach. And if you remember last time, we talked about congregational hymn singing and how hard it was to get that allowed in the churches. Well, it took about 20 years for it to be allowed in Keach's church. They would have their services. Those who wanted to sing after the worship services then would gather. But about 20 years later, they got that. Well, this was his son, Elias. He came over. He wasn't a Christian. He wasn't a believer. But because they knew of the reputation of his father, some people there asked him to preach. Why he would do that, I have no idea, but he agreed to do so. And he, I think, wrote later, he said, when he arrived, he was a very wild spark. He was a stranger to divine grace. But lo and behold, he took him up on it. He started preaching. He started feeling guilty. He confessed his imposture. And Leon Macbeth, you probably know of him, Gary, a professor of church Baptist history at Southwestern Seminary. Leon Macbeth said that he was soundly converted under his own preaching. That's pretty good preaching, you preacher guys out there. So anyway, of course, you have good subjects to work with, maybe. I don't know. But anyway, it's a delightful story. Well, that church became kind of the center of several other congregations, but they were all connected with the Pennapeck Church. And they developed in that area. And I think they stayed with that church until about 1748, and then they kind of formed their own congregations. But in 1707, July 27, 1707, they formed what is called the Philadelphia Association. And this became a very strong, influential movement in the middle colonies and even in other colonies as well. They had gathered together sometimes beginning in 1688 for baptism and kind of business type sessions, and they would ordain ministers in some of these meetings. But it became an official association July 27th, 1727. In 1742, this association published, kind of for its own, the second London Confession of Faith of particular Baptists. And this gave a Reformed or a Calvinistic slant to Baptists in America for a long time. They often would be called regular Baptists. But they adopted the Second London Confession of Faith as their own. It had been published in 1689. I think 1688 and revised in 1689. They added 2 articles to it, which means Baptists can do what they want to when they publish their confessions of faith. These are not written in stone. And one article they called Congregational Hymn Singing and Ordinance of God. So old Benjamin Keach got his influence here over even in America. And then they also added an article which called upon laying hands upon newly baptized believers. And so they added their own things. The thing about confessional theology among Baptists is that it's a positive statement. We are not a creedal people. We do not have these creeds that are written in stone, which all people of all ages, of all times, must believe in order to be Orthodox Christians. but we confess our faith. And most of these confessions have in their preface some statement that guarantees the right of every group of Baptists at any age, at any time, whether it be a church or whether it be groups of churches like in the Philadelphia Association, have the right to publish their own confession of faith for the world to see. And Baptists have usually done this because of sometimes conflict within groups, sometimes accusations from the outside, sometimes just a need to clarify where they are on particular theological issues. But it's, again, a part of the independent spirit that we have as Baptists. One of the most influential Baptists in the association was a man named Morgan Edwards. In 1761, he came from Wales and became the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia. And I think he saw his greatest achievement over here was helping to organize Rhode Island College, later became, I think, Brown University, which we know of today. And so he was very influential in that. He also, and I love him for this, he was a person who began to travel the colonies and gather historical material on Baptists, on churches and groups and individuals. And he had this collection, I think, and he had a total of, I think, information gathered from about 12 of the 13 colonies. I don't know why he didn't do the 13th. I'm not sure. Maybe there was no longer any Baptist work. I think it was Maine. I just kind of looked through the list earlier today. But it was a very important work. And he published, while he was still alive, histories or from the materials of these collections, I think, on Delaware and Pennsylvania. And then after his death, someone else published a few others. They never all got published. One of the interesting things about him is that during the American Revolution, he opposed the revolution. Most Baptists supported the revolution. It was a fight for liberty and for them, especially for religious liberty, but he opposed them. But the reason he opposed them, he had one son fighting for the British and one fighting for the colonists. And so he found himself in that dilemma. And he took some flack over that, but important contribution. Do you have any questions up to date on Williams or the early beginnings of Baptists? Okay. Whoops. Clara, go ahead.
Yeah, not a question, but a comment. I had the privilege of being the executive minister in Rhode Island for 4 years and preaching at First Baptist Church in America numerous times. And all that part of history is so cherished for me. Also 10 years in Massachusetts. So the history, as I learned it, was from the history of the churches. In nuggets of history that perhaps the history books don't have. Like, for example, the First Baptist Church of Boston, when they started building that church, and I don't remember the year, but it was in the mid 1600s. They started building, and they asked for the permit from the city to build a public library. Because if they said it was going to be a Baptist church, they wouldn't have let them.
Well, Baptists are innovative people.
Yeah, when they had the building ready and they were going to worship, they come out that Sunday at 10 o'clock. And of course, the city had wind that it was a Baptist church. And when they went to worship, they found the doors nailed. The city had nailed the doors. They had to go to court and all that. So that's something that is in the history of the church.
Yeah.
But not necessarily history books.
Right, right. I have in the back of my mind the name Thomas Gould that might have been affected with that church, but I'm not sure. It's been
Thomas Gould, yeah.
But they're wonderful stories about all of these churches. Everywhere I go, I come up with some of their history, and it's just fascinating, and the courage and conviction and the obstacles they faced, and they overcame so many. So yeah. Let me say just a few words about the Great Awakening, because it had an important effect upon Baptists in America. When the Great Awakening began, it really kind of took root about the 1740s, although it began about 1726 with preaching of two main figures, Thomas J. Frelinghuysen, who was a Dutch Reform minister, and Gilbert Tennent, who was a Presbyterian minister. And Tennent's father, William Tennent, had formed a kind of a college. They called it the Log College. And a lot of the ministers of the Great Awakening came out of that log college of William Tennant. But the movement began. It I think, started in New England. Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. You remember, you know that sermon title. I preached one time on this, and it was a pretty large group of ministers in an association, and it came out the wrong way. It was Preachers in the Hands of an Angry God, and I was able to get out of there alive, but it was, you know, it was a Freudian slip of the tongue or something on that. I don't know for sure, but anyway, Jonathan Edwards in 1734, and he was not your most dynamic preacher. He manuscript his sermons. He didn't visit his people. He spent I don't know, 12, 13 hours a day in his study writing his sermons. He read them from his manuscript like this. He had thick glasses he couldn't see, and yet he preached a series of sermons, I think about 6, on justification by faith alone. And in about a 1-year period, 300 people were converted and became a part of that church, and the revival spread there. In New England, in the Middle Colonies, the key figure was, oh my gosh, I thought I'd never forget this, George Whitfield, famous evangelist with the Wesleys in England and the Evangelical Awakening there, powerful preacher. He was Calvinistic. The Wesleys were Arminian. They had kind of a split of the ways. But Whitfield, he preached in Wales, revival meetings in Wales and England, came over, tried to form an orphanage in Georgia, I think, may have done that. But anyway, a powerful preacher. And he stirred the crowds and the masses, had a powerful voice. There's a story about Benjamin Franklin who went to one of his meetings, not to hear his message, but to hear how far it would carry. He got behind and he kept backing up further and further. And there's another story that I love about Whitfield. A lady went to hear him, came home and told her neighbor that he was by far the greatest preacher she'd ever heard. She was German. She spoke no English, but just the power of his sermon and his preaching, you know, somehow radically changed her lives. But the revival took off, especially in the Middle Colonies and then in New England. Kind of slower, I think, in the South. But one of the things about the revival, it was very emotional. It was very enthusiastic. Only about 4% of the people in the the colonies at that time, it wasn't the United States, only about 4% of the people were Christians. And that's hard for some people to believe. My students always are aghast. I think everyone came over for religious freedom, and that wasn't the case. But anyway, the movement exploded. And you also had a lot of emotional activities and strange developments, a holy laugh, a holy dance, a holy bark. These were kind of some of the characteristics described for that. And so you had a division among the mainstream churches. The Presbyterians split into the new sides and the old sides. The old sides would be the conservative group. The evangelistic group would be those of the new sides. Same thing with the Congregationalists. And they split into the new lights and the old lights. And the new lights were the evangelical party. And what happened that out of this, many of these new lights, it was an easy step for them to take to become Baptists and adopt believers' baptism because of the personal nature of the message. And one of the key figures in that was Isaac Backus, very well known in Massachusetts, Liliana, a legend there with all that he did. And he's the one that worked so hard to get the Congregational church disestablished in Massachusetts. And I think the year was, I think it was 1833 was when it was finally disestablished, but it was the last established state church in the United States. One of the stories about him that I really like is that he received a letter from his mother, and she told about sitting by her fire in the evening, reading the Bible, and the authorities came in and arrested her because she hadn't paid her church tax, and she wound up being thrown into jail. Think about getting a letter from mom. Hi, son, I'm in jail. How you doing? Yeah, but anyway, there was a price to be paid, and these were real heroes for us. A couple of other individuals who came out of the New Light movement were two brothers-in-law, Shubal Stearns and Daniel Marshall. And they moved to the south, went to a place called Sandy Creek, North Carolina. And there in Sandy Creek, they started out with 16 members. And in 17 years, they had grown to 606 members. Out of that one church came 42 other churches through that church's evangelistic efforts in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And also out of those churches came a total of 125, I guess we would say, flaming evangelistic ministers and pastors. And they became a part of the movement of the South. They later became a part of the regular Baptists, and then after that, they became a part of Southern Baptists. So the Great Awakening had a very important effect upon Baptists. We benefited enormously from what was going on in the country at that particular time. I might also, I don't think I told you this story, but during this period of time between the First Awakening and the Second Awakening, which began, I think right around the early 1800s, but we'd had the American Revolution, and we were successful, and we had adopted the Articles of Confederation, which gave no power at all to the federal government and had to be changed. So there was a move to get a Constitution of the United States. And so the Constitution was proposed. They were going to hold a constitutional meeting in Philadelphia, and the different areas were to elect their delegates to go to vote on the proposed Constitution of the United States. In Orange County, Virginia, the Baptists were going to put forth a candidate to promote to go and vote against the Constitution of the United States. And the reason they were doing this is because it had no guarantees for basic freedoms, religion, press, speech. These were things that they had fought for, and they wanted them in the Constitution. One of the candidates was James Madison. And Madison didn't see a real problem with that. He thought that they were implied, that it wouldn't be an issue. But he had a meeting with these Baptists led by John Leland, Elder John Leland, and they discussed the concerns of the Baptists. And finally, the Baptists convinced him that these freedoms needed to be guaranteed in the Constitution. So Madison said, okay, I'll run, and if you help me get elected, I will go. We will adopt the Constitution. That's something we have to do. But as soon as we do, I will propose a series of amendments to the Constitution of the United States. And so the Baptists withdrew their candidate. It was either Leland or a fellow named James Barber. Madison was elected. He went, the Constitution was adopted. And at the very constitutional, first constitutional meeting of the House, at that meeting, he proposed what became known as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. And the First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And then it goes on to guarantee freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. So I think I left one of them out there. But anyway, Baptists had a major role, I think, in seeing that we had the guarantees of religious freedom that begins the very First Amendment of the Constitution. So that developed during this particular time. Okay, let me shift gears and talk about Baptist organizations. And this could get dull and boring, but I hope it doesn't. But Baptists initially organized into regional associations. We mentioned the Philadelphia Association in 1707. The Warren Association was organized in New England in 1767 in Warren, I started to say Massachusetts, but I think it's Warren, Rhode Island. Can you help me on that, Liliana, or do you know? Okay.
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, good. That's
Warren, Rhode Island.
Yeah, it scared me for a while. But anyway, the Warren Association, and then in the South, there was a Charleston Association that developed as well, 1751. Baptists did not organize in the United States until the year 1814. And we did this for the first time on a national level. There were a couple of reasons. One, the cause of foreign missions. Kind of interestingly, the Baptists really began to get interested in foreign missions because of the British Missionary Society. Britain did not want them sending missionaries to their colonies. And so they couldn't catch a ship out of Britain. So they would catch a ship, they would come to Boston, they would spend a little bit of time in Boston, and they would go to the various Baptist churches and talk about the work of foreign missions or international missions. In fact, the Massachusetts Baptist Missionary Society was the first such organization in the United States in 1803. And so you had this spirit beginning to take place in this strong interest, and the Baptists began to support the British missionaries. The other development that took place was the Second Awakening. And this took place in different regions. There was the Western frontier, Kentucky, Tennessee. There was a phase in New England. New England was less emotional and had less emphasis on mass evangelism. In the West, you had these great revival meetings and these camp meetings, and it was an exciting period of time for the people in the West. But back along the Atlantic seaboard, it expressed itself in organizations, mission organizations, home missions, foreign missions, publication organizations, organizations for education. And so the energy of the revival there was expressed in many of the Baptist churches along the Atlantic seaboard in these various ministries. Well, that set the stage. We wound up having a few missionaries we were not expecting, which I think laid the foundation for our first national organization. The Congregationalists had been sending out missionaries, I think, since 1810. And they sent out in 1812 a newly married couple, Anne and Adoniram Judson. That name should be familiar to many of you. And the Judsons set sail. They couldn't take a plane, but they set sail for India. And it was a long trip. And Adoniram began to study the scriptures in the Greek and came to the conclusion, he'd had these debates with Baptists, the Baptists were right on the issue of baptism. So when he arrived there, he and Anne talked with William Ward, a British Baptist missionary, and Ward baptized them. And we now had two missionaries. Shortly thereafter, Luther Rice also came. He was a single guy, wanted to be a missionary. They said, sure, if you can raise the money. He did, and he showed up. And the Judsons convinced him of the Baptist view, and William Ward baptized Luther Rice. I'm sure in his first report after that, back to the British missionaries, it said, not doing so well among the heathen, as they called them, but send us more Congregationalists. We're doing great there, So anyway, we had three missionaries and a way to support them. So Rice came back and began to go and speak to the Baptists in America for the cause. In 1814 in Philadelphia, a group of Baptists met, and there they formed the General Missionary Convention of the Baptist Denomination in the United States for foreign missions. That's a mouthful. But someone said, hey, we meet every 3 years. Let's call it the Triennial Convention. That unknown person is a hero even today. Would you try to put that on your business card, Jeremy? That would be a lot. You wouldn't have anything for your email address. But anyway, they formed an organization. Initially, the Triennial Convention supported foreign missions and home missions and publications and education work. But by 1826, they had limited themselves to foreign mission work, or international missions, as we would call them today. But out of this, and not all Baptists in America joined this organization, but many did in New England, the Middle Colonies, and in the South. In 1826, the Baptist General Tract Society was organized, and they began publishing pamphlets, and they published 19 pamphlets in their first year on issues of doctrine and devotions and moral topics. And by 1830, they had published 110 titles and had I guess, distributed about just under 1.4 million pamphlets. They also began to publish single volumes. They published the Baptist Manual, and the Baptist Manual was a work that kind of summarized a lot of these pamphlets. And they also published a hymnal, the Psalmist, in 1845. And the publications were very, very important. One of the interesting things about the split between Baptists in the North and the South that led to the Civil War, the Baptists in the South continued to use the publications of the Publication Society. It became known as the American Baptist Publication Society. So they didn't have their own society. It was not a doctrinal split when we talk about the division over slavery in our country. And we'll mention that in a few moments. So anyway, the Tract Society, it started out in Washington, D.C., but it moved to Philadelphia. And it started, I think, in Philadelphia in 1827. In 1840, the name was changed to the American Baptist Publication and Sunday School Society. shortened form American Baptist Publication Society. And they began to publish books along with Sunday school lesson helps. And they were really important in the advance of the work. The Sunday school movement it began in England, it carried on over here, and it was a very strong evangelistic tool of the churches for years and years, not so much today. And then in 1832, April 22nd, the American Baptist Home Mission Society was organized. There were a couple of individuals, John Mason Peck and Jonathan Going, and they surveyed the needs in the West. Well, the West was Kentucky and Indiana and Illinois, my home state. And they surveyed that in 1831, and Going served as the first corresponding secretary for this new organization, the American Baptist Home Mission Society. And they, in their first year, they sent about 50 missionaries out into 10 different states, 2 territories, and Lower Canada. So they began to work on the home mission scene. In 1845, the society sent out 2 missionaries, Ezra Fisher and Hezekiah Johnson, to the Oregon Territory. And Hezekiah Johnson established or organized the First Baptist Church of Oregon City, where I not long ago served as interim pastor. It is the oldest continuing Baptist church in the West. There were, I think, about 3 other churches established before this. The West Union is the first one, and they still have the building they use in some public sense, I think, out somewhere out west of Portland. But this is the oldest church in continuous existence. They organized on July the 4th in 1847, and so they're 170 plus years old. I'm now interim of one of the newly started churches, First Baptist Charleston, and they are 150 years plus old, but they were one of the early churches in the area as well. And so a Baptist historian likes going to these places. I just feel a sense of history there. But important work that you have, and Hezekiah Johnson and Ezra Fisher were key leaders. Johnson established a church in Oregon City. Fisher was more like kind of an itinerant preacher in different churches. In fact, he took about a year off and went to the gold field in California and did pretty well, and then came back. And he really got into education more so than into church building and church planning. So that's how we wound up organizing on the national scene, and we formed 3 societies for the first time. The split over slavery divided the country. I won't get into this. We were not the only ones splitting. The Methodists split in 1845, as did the Baptists. The Presbyterians split in 1851. Those 2 organizations, Methodists and Presbyterians, eventually got back together. The Baptists never did. And it was over politics, it was over economics, social issues, ethical issues. All of these things rolled into one. One of the things about the 2 groups, the Baptists of the North and the Baptists of the South, is the fact that the Baptists in the North followed the society approach, an individual society for each important ministry. They had their own organizations, they raised their own funds, they sent out their own missionaries. The Baptists in the South had a convention approach, kind of an umbrella over the various ministries like foreign missions, home missions, publications, annuities, and they developed a number of organizations. And so that was a difference. That led to the fact that Baptists in the North began to do some changing. In 1907, they changed to a convention. It just wasn't working. It was hard because you had a lack of continuity. You had societies competing with one another for funds, and there were other number of issues. So they changed to a convention approach in 1907, and they called it the Northern Baptist Convention. They founded Northern Baptist Theological Seminary in 1913, and they elected a woman, Helen B. Montgomery, as president of the convention in 1921. This is pretty radical, pretty important. Proud of them for that. They also began to have controversies. They were Baptists. There was the modernist fundamentalist controversy around the turn of the century, the early 20th century. And a number of ministers and theological seminaries began to adopt the tools of biblical criticism, textual criticism, for example, and higher criticism. And also, many of these theological seminaries and ministers began to appreciate the contributions of science, and that was not always the case for all Baptists during this time. The more conservative Baptists published a thing called the Fundamentals 12 small volumes, and in this they stressed about 5 things: unshakable truths, the virgin birth, the bodily resurrection of Christ, the inerrancy or infallibility of the scriptures, the substitutionary theory of atonement — there are several different theories on that — and the imminent physical second coming of Christ. These were the things that they held on to. No compromise on that. Henry Emerson Fosdick, some of you may know of him, well-known pastor, and he published a pamphlet, Shall the Fundamentalists Win? And of course, his answer would be no. Anyway, this led to divisions. In 1933, there was a group of fundamentalists withdrew from the convention, and they formed the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches, the GARB. And it was like a society. It allowed both churches and individuals to be members. And a second split occurred in 1947 when the fundamentalists formed the Conservative Baptist Association of America. And in 1950, the CBAA formed the Conservative Baptist Theological Seminary in Denver, and later sponsored the establishment of the Western Conservative Baptist Theological Seminary in Portland, Oregon. So we had these fights, we had these divisions. It's not anything new. We've had our meaningful dialogue with our association a time or two along the way, Jeremy. It's not something new. It's happened along the way. And it challenges us either to be creative or to withdraw, and the conservative approach basically withdraws and we expand where we are, where we're going. A couple of other things. In 1950, the name was changed to the American Baptist Convention rather than the Northern Baptist Convention. Working in a broader space, we didn't want to be regionalized. And then, and I think some of my Southern Baptist friends from those days, some of them didn't really like that. They felt like that the American Baptists beat us to the punch on that. That was a good name, and they were thinking about it. So I'm glad we won over here after becoming an American Baptist. And then in 1972, the American Baptist churches of the United States names changed to that, and it really reflects, I think, who we are as a group, as an organization. It emphasizes a looser denominational polity. It really respects the independency of the local church. If you ever hear of anyone talking about a denomination called the American Baptist Church, they're dead wrong. We are not the American Baptist Church. It's the plural, the American Baptist churches. And it talks about, I think, one, it respects the independency of who we are, and yet at the same time, it also respects the autonomy of the local congregation under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And so we caught up with that. There are about 5,000 ABC churches today, and the last I saw, somewhere around 1.3 million members. We are the most diverse major denomination in the United States. I think 47% of our churches, our membership, are ethnic groups. And I think that's something we can be very, very proud of. It's not something we tried to just add on to later. There are other Baptist groups that are out there that I won't get into, but there are several national Baptist organizations: National Baptist Convention, National Baptist Convention of the USA, Progressive National Baptist Convention, National Missionary Baptist Conventions. Some of our churches, I know here in the Portland area, are duly aligned with the Progressive Baptists and the American Baptists. And so we find different ways of doing things, and we're not locked into where we were. But when I look at Baptists and when I look at our history, it's a continuing evaluation, reevaluation, adjusting, changing. And I think we're doing that. And I really do think Grant Park is on the cutting edge of some of these changes that need to be made in the 21st century. And proud of this little ship. You know, we're the little church that can and do. Okay, that's what I had to say. Now answer me all the questions. And if you make them true, false questions, it'll be a lot easier.
I wonder if I can share, you know, as Liliana shared a little piece of what you discover when you walk into churches, and I might be the only one here who pastored one of the old churches, or the one who pastored the oldest churches among us, because in 2008 I was called to serve the Old Mystic Baptist Church in Old Mystic, Connecticut. But that church happened to be operating under a different name, the First Baptist Church of Groton, Connecticut, founded in 1705 by Valentine Wyman. So I got in touch with all the history of the Wymans in the state of Connecticut, and also in relation with the Rhode Island, which was so close. We were living in Rhode Island at that time. It was an incredible experience. Just in a nutshell, the history in the 19th century, and I always used to joke about it, it became sort of a mega church for its time. They were baptizing people in the Mystic River in winter. And I mean, anyone familiar with the climate in New England, you know, you can imagine. I mean, we can try that in Oregon. They might have done it, but I learned that history. Yeah, and also the relationship with the Mohegans and the Pequot, Indians. It was very, very good, and so it's such a rich history of revival and the persistence and the commitment of Baptists. The Wymans were a family of preachers that came from England, and actually one of the sons, I think it was John Gano Wyman, succeeded the father. We still have Camp Wyman in Connecticut, but it's so rich. And unfortunately, I have to finish saying that it has closed, and it's not my fault. But it closed a couple of years ago. I left in 2011, so it lasted a few more years. But anyway, it's so good to have a piece of the Baptist history. I'm a third-generation Baptist, and it was surprising that they called a South American with an accent as a pastor of the oldest church, the oldest Baptist church in the state of Connecticut.
Yeah, that would be very exciting, I'm sure. You mentioned the baptism. The first baptism I ever performed, I was a student pastor at the Candock Missionary Baptist Church outside of Lebanon, Missouri. And a young soldier from Fort Leonard Wood had become a Christian, wanted to be baptized. We didn't have a baptistry, but First Baptist Church of Lebanon would allow us to do that, but he didn't want to do that. He wanted to be baptized in living water, I think is the way they called it. And not far from our church was the Bennett Springs State Trout Park. And this huge spring coming out, and they stocked it with trout, but the temperatures were always between 43 and 47 degrees. But there was a nice little level area sloping down into the stream coming out of that sandy area, and the church could baptize there. So the park didn't open until March 1st. So this was February. And we go down there in February, and it hails that afternoon. And I wade out in there and I put him under, and it didn't take long, I can tell you. And I would always tell my students, I said, I put him under, we sang Shall We Shiver at the River, and we got out of there. You know, it was cold. I baptized there 3 times, and it really twice was during the trout season. And it was kind of a delight to see the fishermen. They would just move away. We do our thing, they move back in. So it was a wonderful experience. And you baptized, is it in the Columbia, Jeremy? Or yeah. So that's a good experience.
Yeah.
Comments or questions?
Real quick, I just gotta say that I was baptized in a mountain lake in October, and it was so cold. But I have that kind of like, I want the living water too if I can. Yeah. So we've done 2 baptisms since I got here, and they're both in the river.
Yeah.
But I saw David raise his hand. Sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to refer folks, if they haven't seen it, I wrote a couple of things in the chat that are relevant to the conversation, and I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I saw the one on the 37 different organizations of Baptists, and there might even be more out there. I've seen different numbers on that, but and also there's so many small independent Baptist churches. They're not connected with anyone, but the practice of baptism is a good nickname that many people have hung on to. What was the other one that you put up, David?
So I just mentioned Roger Williams. I've been a leader of the Roger Williams Fellowship of American Baptists, so I've had a chance to study quite a bit about him. And it's a group within the American Baptist churches that stands for soul liberty, congregational freedom, separation of church and state. those things that William stood for. But anyway, he has, though he's been dead almost 400 years. Well, actually, he lived a long time, just 320 years or so he's been dead, 340. Anyway, he's still got 2 published books that you could find in certainly any seminary library and maybe in some public libraries. And I mentioned in the chat the name of those 2 books and what they're about.
Okay. I was going to mention he published a kind of an anonymous pamphlet, I think when he was in London trying to get a charter, a bloody tenet of persecution, talking about the persecution.
Right, that's one, against the bloody tenet of persecution. Yeah. The idea being that no civil magistrate or government had the right to force anyone's conscience in any way, much less by actual persecution. The other, interestingly enough, and I've held this in my hand, I've looked through it, I've read it pretty much, is a glossary, an English glossary of the lingua franca of the New England native tribes. Because he mingled among the New England tribes, he became conversant, not in all their dialects, but in the kind of lingua franca that they had collectively. And he published a glossary, and it's still extant. I found it in a seminary library a few years ago.
Yeah. You mentioned books. I probably mentioned this when I was interim at Grant Park, and I may have mentioned it last time, but I don't think so. But James Madison, when I was at Oklahoma Baptist teaching, a friend of mine who had been a librarian at Ouachita Baptist University said, I want to show you something. So we went out and had coffee. He had a box of books that his library there at Ouachita in Arkadelphia, Arkansas, had phased out and gotten rid of. And he wanted me just to look through them. And I looked through them, and here was one, was David Benedict's 1812 History of Baptists in America. It was a 2-volume work. And here was one of those. And I opened up on the inside, and it says, "Saved from the Burning of the White House" by Dolly Madison. And I looked at that and, oh my, and I wanted, I paid him 50 cents for it, but I gave it to the, at the time, the Southern Baptist Historical Society, and they still have it today. But boy, I wanted to hang on to that. But I have no doubts about it because, the White House burned during that time. Madison was close to the Baptists and had these communications. And if he had a history, it would have been about, I think it was 1814, wasn't it, when the White House burned? Yeah, and this was published in 1812. And if that little handwritten note is true, I had a little bit of history myself on that, but I let it go. Other questions related to what we're talking about, Dave?
Yeah. So Tanya and my home church, Emerald Baptist in Eugene, is one of those that split when the CBA really took over a lot of churches in Oregon. And so it split for First Baptist Eugene. And when we were growing up there in the 80s, I mean, that was a lot of part of the history of that church is, the loyalty to the ABC and the loyalty to the foreign mission work that this group of loyalists had gone out and formed Emerald Baptist. My memory is that the CBA was particularly effective in taking over churches in Oregon and maybe one upper Midwestern state. Is my memory right on that? And if so, why would the center of the CBA universe be in Oregon and the upper Midwest? Seems odd.
I don't have an answer to that. I'm more attuned to the Baptist fights in Southern Baptist life, having waged a battle or two myself along the way. But I really don't know. It's food for thought. I almost would have thought that this would have been a very open area out here, but then since I got out here, I see that there are pockets of politics, that are left and right, and the churches are probably like that as well. But the splits over theology, have affected a lot of the Baptist groups. And I think it's a part of our independence. I do think the fact that we fight over theology is a sign of life. It means that we're not bored to tears. It just seems like I never can be on the winning side. That's always where these battles turn out. But I'm still standing after all that year. But the ability to discuss issues, sometimes arm wrestle over issues, I think it can have its positive if it's not destructive. I look in Southern Baptist life, the reason I left was I was just so tired of the fighting, and the things that I cherished, and you probably get in most of these Baptist churches before fights come along, are very solid and sound. Religious liberty, congregational polity, soul competency that David has talked about here. These are treasured movements, but they come under attack when someone has an agenda that they want to impose upon the people. And that's what happened in Southern Baptist life, and I couldn't believe it. The one thing that surprised me more than anything else in Southern Baptist life was when they backed away from religious liberty and separation of church and state. I never thought I would see that happen in a Baptist church, and yet they bought in so easily to what is called accommodationism in that regard. And that was one of the reasons women in ministry, they had made advances in Southern Baptist life. There were setbacks when the latest controversy came along, and that was another of the things. And I just have too much of an independent spirit. Baptists taught me freedom, and I love that. And I also respect it in the diversity out there. That's why I can get along with a lot of these churches where I serve as interim, is because I respect their freedom. And hopefully I can plant some seeds that will help them, like people planted seeds in my life along the way. But I like being a Baptist. I really do. At our very best, there's nothing I'd rather be. At our worst, we smell up the place. I told you the deal about Noah's Ark. I have a joke. Maybe this can be the end of it. I don't know if any of you remember, but when I was a teenager, we used to do canvases of the community and go out and find out who believes what, who goes to what churches there. And I don't know if I ever participated in one. I may have. Gary may remember, you look like some of these, but I remember this story about a young man who'd become a Baptist, and he was so excited, and the church decided to do a canvass. And so he volunteered. And so they gave him all the materials with the questions to ask and that. And he goes to this house, he knocks on the door, this guy comes and he says, I'm so-and-so from First Baptist Church down here. We're doing a canvass of the community. Would you answer a few questions? The guy said, sure. And he says, can you tell me what denomination you are, what church you go to? He said, well, we're Lutherans. And he said, and why are you Lutherans? He said, well, our parents were Lutherans. That's the way we were raised. You know, we're very comfortable with that. He goes to the next place. He asks the question. The lady says, well, we're Methodists. Why are you Methodist? Well, that's what our parents were and their parents were. It's our whole family's been Methodist. And he writes that down, goes to the next place. And he's getting a little bit tired. He said, if I get this again, I got to do something. And so he asked this guy this question. He said, what are you? He said, well, we're Presbyterians. And why are you Presbyterians? Because our parents were Presbyterians. That's why we're Presbyterians. Well, what would you be if your parents had been idiots? What do you think, Martha? Baptist? Idiot's not a very good term. Idiot's not a very good term to use. I apologize. I tell it with a different word, but it came out the first time I heard it. So,
I've got a question. First off, that was a great history. I really appreciate that. I've never heard it discussed like that, and I majored in Bible in college, so that was great. I wish I'd have been in your classes. And then, but is there any Southern Baptist, any American Baptist churches in the South? Is there churches down there? I just, I don't recall any in like Dallas or, the cities I've been in the South, but are there American Baptists in those areas, or what is the American Baptist approach to being like in the South or other areas?
Gary, there were a lot of churches that were duly aligned. In Oklahoma, I was a member of First Baptist Church, and they were duly aligned with the American Baptist Convention and the Southern Baptist Convention. In fact, the church was founded by American Baptist missionaries. And so I would say at least there was at one time. Then finally, they decided to make a decision, and they voted to go with Southern Baptist. That was in Shawnee, Oklahoma. And I suppose there's some others. David, you know some?
So there are 34 American Baptist regions, and some of them are still associated with states. Most of them comprise parts of more than one state, but there is an American Baptist Churches of the South, which is a geographic region, and most of the churches are predominantly African American churches who went with American Baptists because of the racial inclusiveness and the freedom heritage that's common with us.
I would have never thought about that, but I can see that. Yeah, very much so.
But
Liliana?
if you think about geography, like Liliana mentioned, she was the executive minister in Rhode Island. That's one region. Connecticut's one region. Massachusetts is one region.
Mhm.
DC, Metro DC is one region. And then American Baptist Churches of the South. I mean, it's a huge area that is on kind of equal footing with all these much geographically smaller regions. West Virginia is kind of the one exception to the rule because there actually are a lot of ABC churches in West Virginia, so it's its own region. But everything else that I would consider in the South, except for West Virginia, is just in this one massive region that, as David said, has disproportionately either predominantly African American churches or some Latinx churches, or just more progressive majority white churches. I think that's that region.
Actually, West Virginia, in spite of its political and cultural conservatism, has the largest number of distinct churches, many of them small, but of any of the American Baptist regions, there are over 400 in the state of West Virginia, which is about half the geographical area of Oregon.
Liliana, you were going to say something? Okay.
Yes, we were dealing with the microphone here. There are some newer, anyways, Brazilian American Baptist churches in Texas, because some Brazilians moved from Massachusetts to Texas, pastors, and planted American Baptist churches there. And there was at one time an effort to make Florida a church planting state for Latino churches. So I'm not aware of how many remain, if there are some, but yeah, there are. We have churches in the South.
Yeah, I have a couple of Latinx friends who are cooperative Baptist, and we have conversations with them in the Southwest, also in Texas, regarding recruiting students for the Latinx initiative at the BST. So that's maybe a little bit of unknown territory, but you know, it brings me to the question of how, because when I look at Latinx churches all over and the many influences other than Baptist and the lack of awareness of maybe it's not a question, it's a complaint, I guess, awareness of Baptist principles that when we teach them, and actually Liliana teaches Baptist polity for this Latino initiative, which is another undergraduate program at BST. Some of the students go, aha, you know, they like the whole question of the autonomy of the local church and you know, freedom of consciousness or soul liberty, and now we have not many, but they're enamored of being Baptist. But unfortunately, when you go to an association, they maintain the association principle, like in the Northern California, associated with our same our region here, the what is it, Central Pacific Coast region. They are, you know, led by former Pentecostal, unprepared, untrained pastors. So that's painful.
Yeah, I think one of the things I do appreciate the effort of American Baptists is that if you come from another denomination and you want your ordination recognized, you have to take the ABC history and polity course, which I enjoy teaching. There was one other thing that probably shaped where Baptists are, is that after the split between the Baptists of the North and the South, and I'm not sure how long it took, but they began to realize they were overlapping their work, and they developed what was called comity agreements. And the Baptists of the North says, we will work in these areas and these areas and these areas in home mission work. And the Baptists of the South said, we'll do this and we won't cross over into your areas. And it worked for quite a while, but the American Baptists had California on their list, but Southern Baptists were moving into California at a great rate. And so finally, the Southern Baptists stopped honoring the comity agreements and then started doing work in that areas. And so those eventually broke down, but they made an effort, and that would shape, I think, like there are lots of American Baptist churches in Kansas and not that many Southern Baptist churches. I just remember being kind of struck by that at one time. So, it's an ongoing thing.
We are familiar with California. I was actually canvassing churches, if you will, recruiting for the BST for the last 5 years or more. When we first came to California back in the 80s, it was all ABC. We had so many churches. Some have been taken over by Southern Baptists, and actually it takes just a minister who is not even trained. They don't have the training that we ask from our own people. But when I after 25 years in New England and in Southern California, when we came back in 2011, we went back to California Northern California in 2011. I was amazed, how many Baptist churches, and they are with the Southern Baptist Convention. So for me, it's sad.
One of the things that I noticed happened in Southern Baptist life, and it may have happened in American Baptist life as well, I'm just not certain, but in Southern Baptist life, there would be a lot of independent Baptists out there, and it wasn't a very good network. And they saw in Southern Baptists a couple of things. They saw a good network where you could move from one church to the other, and an independent local church could call whoever they wanted to. And they also saw a good retirement program, which they needed to buy into. And so it became very easy for independents who could convince a Baptist church that, they were what they were looking for, and they could become Baptists in that particular regard, or Southern Baptists, simply because it was a good network for moving from one church to another, because there were so many of them, and it had a good retirement program, good benefits as such. And I think we attracted a lot of people that became a good core of those when the controversy in the Southern Baptist Convention broke out in the late 70s, that would be going on the side that we traditional Baptists, would have opposed in the things that they were doing. But I think that happens sometimes. I saw it happen in Southern Baptist life, in which we got infiltrated, if you want to use the term, by people who did not come from a Southern Baptist background, or did not even come from a Baptist background, but they kind of baptized themselves in such a way, but still carried who they were, into our churches and into our pulpits. And the traditional training, we used to have a good church training program that one of the things they did on Sunday evenings was look at Baptist doctrine and look at Baptist history and look at church history, and that disappeared by the wayside. Sunday night football hurt that a lot too. So
okay, I'm gonna cut us short because we're going over.
Okay.
But thank you, Slayden, so much for all of this, and I'm also really glad to hear everyone's questions and comments and everything.
Yeah.
It's good to hear the discussion afterwards. So thank you, Slayden. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And next month, Gary is going to share his story about why he's a Baptist. So we're going to get...
I'm a Baptist.
What was that, Gary?
Well, I'm a Baptist. I put this on my calendar or on my journal so I can start writing it out, because I can't type. There's no way I can top Slayden on that at all, but I've got some things I want to say, so I'm going to do that. So anyway.
Oh man, I'm excited. So tune in next month to hear Gary talk about why he's a Baptist. Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Slayden, for 2 awesome lectures. Yes. And we miss you while you're at FBC Carleton, but we're glad you're there. So good night, everybody.
So long. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Slayden.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.